Okay, I'm going to go over some of the problems that will be similar to the questions on your quiz. So remember to continue practicing, use that practice quiz that we did in class that was posted on Schoology. Go back and go through the questions. I'm going to write down some problems that are going to be very similar to those and for your quiz. So if you have a positive 6 plus a negative 4. So remember, you're looking at the numbers signs, one's a positive, one's a negative. So you know you're going to subtract those two numbers because you're combining these together, a positive 6 and a negative 4, you're adding those together. So the signs are opposites, so you would subtract. 6 minus 4 would give you 2. And then you should also know that the sign is going to be positive because the 6 is the bigger number and the 6 is a positive. So let me do one similar to that, but it'll be opposite signs. So for example, on this side, if you instead had a positive 4 and then plus the negative 6. So if you had one like this, remember, you're still having opposite signs, so you're still subtracting. So you would still do 6 minus 4, which would give you 2. However, on this one, since the 6 is the bigger number and it's a negative, your answer would be negative 2. Now remember, if you're subtracting a negative, so if we use these same numbers and we have a positive 4 minus a negative 6. Remember, if you're subtracting a negative, it turns into a positive. So you'd end up with a 4 plus 6, which would be 10. Remember, write down the problems on your quiz. If it's subtracting a negative, do this, what I'm doing here, turn it into a plus, and you add those two numbers. Now, if you're adding two negatives, something like this, negative 12 plus negative 5. So remember, you're adding two negatives. They have the same signs, so you find the sum of the two numbers. You have a negative 12 plus a negative 5. You would end up with a negative 17 because you're adding the 12 and the 5, and they're both negative numbers. That's like owing one person $12 and owing someone else $5. You would owe in total $17. I'll do another one similar to that, but this time subtracting two negatives. So if we had a negative 12 minus the negative 5. So in this one here, you would still have the negative 12, and then you'd be this time adding 5 because you'd be getting rid of 5 negatives. You'd be subtracting 5 negatives. This would turn into a plus 5. So remember, now you have opposite signs. You have a negative and a positive. You subtract those two numbers, and 12 minus 5 is 7. And then you do what we did on the previous problems. Look at the number. 12 is bigger. It's a negative. So there's more negatives than positives. I'll move on to some multiplication and division. So you should remember the rule for this. If you're doing a negative 5 times a negative 4, remember the negative times the negative will result in a positive. So you would just multiply. So you should remember that rule. Negative times negative is positive. If you had opposite signs, if you had a negative 4 times a positive 5, you would then know that opposites, right? It's like we said earlier, opposites subtract. With the opposites, you'd end up with a negative. So you this time get negative 20. Same rule is true for division as well. if you had a negative 20 divided by a positive 5. Remember, the signs are opposites, so your answer would be negative, and 20 divided by 5 is 4, so you'd have a negative 4. If you're dividing two negatives and you had negative 90 divided by negative 10, a negative divided by a negative, just like a negative times a negative, that would result in a positive, and this would be a positive 9. And then a few of the challenge questions where you have to get the final answer to be 0. If you had one like this and you had a positive 6 plus something to get 0, you should know that the number you're going to place in there is going to be a negative 6, because positive 6 plus a negative 6 would result in 0. If you had a different one, like negative 6 minus something to get 0, now in this case, you'd want to put a negative 6 here again on the inside. Because remember, subtracting a negative turns into a positive. Negative 6 plus 6 does equal 0. So continue to practice and review those. Go through the practice quiz that was posted on class on Wednesday, that's in Schoology, and go through those problems.